Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the best top laners for patch 6.19. So first up is actually going to be Swain. Now Swain was a champion a few patches ago who was pretty much pick or ban, and he was extremely strong in the top lane. Now I feel like he's actually still really strong and people have just kind of forgot about him. He did get that nerf to his ultimate, which in my opinion really wasn't that big, but he stopped seeing play in the competitive scene, and therefore when people stop seeing a champion being played in competitive, they think that it's just useless and that they shouldn't pick it anymore, when in reality Swain is still a really good pick for solo queue, and you should definitely pick him up or try him again if you haven't played him in a while. He's a great lane bully in the top lane. He can win almost every single matchup as long as he does play it correctly. He also scales very well into the late game, and he's got a very good 2-item and 3-item power spike. Once he does get his Rod of Ages, or if you want to go for the other, if you want to go for the Hextech GLP item, and then once you get the Zhonya's on him, that's a really big power spike. And then also if the enemy team has a lot of AP damage and you can get your Rod item, you can get your Zhonya's and then your Spirit Visage, you're just so tanky, yet you still deal so much damage. And if you can get to that 3-item spike, you can basically still like burst squishy targets, but you're just going to be pretty much impossible to kill in team fights. Now when should you not pick Swain? I would pick him in most matchups. He really doesn't have like a hard counter in the top lane. I would try to avoid Soraka though, and any heavy kite comps. The reason you want to avoid Soraka is because Swain does a lot of sustained damage during team fights, and with the Soraka, she can just easily heal up Swain's damage that he does in team fights, so you want to try to avoid her. Also, definitely look to pick him if your team does lack AP damage. So next up is going to be Irelia. So Irelia is still really strong in the top lane. She's been a great pick in the top lane for the past few patches ever since Trinity Force did get changed. She's a really good dueling champion. Once she does hit her level 6 and once she does get Sheen and Trinity Force, she becomes a monster in the top lane. She can pretty much outduel like any other top laner as long as she does play it correctly and as long as she can get the stun off. She's also a very strong mid-game champion. Once you do get Trinity Force on Irelia, it's one of the best power spikes for any champion in the game, and if you can start team fighting at around that point when you get Trinity Force, then you can really take advantage of that and just end up winning the game before the 25 to 30 minute point. She's also a bruiser top lane champion, so when I play Irelia, I only go Trinity Force. After that, I usually just go full tank, yet you can still deal so much damage. If you are snowballing in the early game, or if your team does lack damage, then you can go for like another AD item on Irelia. You can go Trinity Force, you could go like a Blade Ruin King. If they do have a lot of AP, then you can go a Maw. You don't have to go like full tank every single game, it just does depend on the situation. And as for when you should not pick Irelia, two matchups that she does tend to struggle with are Pantheon and Malphite. According to statistics, those are the two matchups that she does really bad in. The reason she does bad against Pantheon is because of his passive, and also because Pantheon can just abuse Irelia's weaker early game and just poke her down really easily. And as for Malphite, Malphite does a really good job at countering any like auto attack damage based champions. So whenever Malphite throws his E down, it will reduce Irelia's attack speed, and therefore she's not really going to be able to get too much damage off against the Malphite as long as he does play it correctly. Also, if your team is lacking team fight, then Irelia isn't like the top tier team fight champion, so if your team is really lacking team fight, then I would pick one of the other champions that are coming up on my list. And also, if the enemy team does lock someone like a Gangplank, a Yasuo, or a Gnar, then definitely look to pick Irelia in those situations because she's a really good counter to them. Next up is actually going to be Jace. Now Jace has seen really good success these past few patches after he did get that buff to his ultimate. His all-in potential now is just really good, and it allows him to get a snowball going in the early game, and it allows him to just burst down targets a lot faster now. He's a really good lane bully champion too, so he does great in most matchups, especially against any melee top laners. When I play Jace, if I am in a matchup where I know I can get a kill in the early game, then I might run Ignite and I just might try to snowball the early game really hard, because if you do get ahead with Jace, your poke damage is going to hurt so much and you're just going to be able to siege down towers really nicely. You're going to be able to like poke squishy targets to around half HP, maybe a little bit above half HP with your EQ combo, so that will just allow you to take towers and just end up winning the game really early on if you can get a lead with Jace. He also does have a really strong burst all-in combo. If you can get your EQ off and then go into hammer form and just use all of your abilities, then that's pretty much the freest 100 to 0 that you can have, and it's pretty easy to execute as well. As long as you can hit your EQ, as long as you don't miss that, then you're pretty much guaranteed to burst down the squishy target every single time. Now, as for when and when you should not pick Jace, I would not recommend picking him if your team is really lacking that team fight. So if you have someone like a Nidalee jungle and a Karma support, then I wouldn't pick him in that situation. Also, try to avoid Malphite and Yasuo. Those are two matchups that he does tend to struggle in a little bit, and he can pretty much do well in most other matchups as long as you do have the basics down on Jace. Next up here is going to be one of my favorite top laners, Kennen. So Kennen is pretty much my go-to pick in the top lane right now. He's actually projected to see some play at this upcoming World Championships. A lot of the casters and a lot of the analysts think that Kennen's actually a top tier pick right now for competitive play. He's also a really good pick for solo queue as well. The reason being is because his team fight is really strong, and he's also got really good pick potential with his Flash Proto Belt. His Flash Proto Belt combo is just so hard to counter, and it's so hard to work against, because if you're playing AD carry against a Kennen, or if you're playing someone in the mid lane like a Syndra or a Twisted Fate or a Lux, it's going to be really hard for you to position well in team fights if Kennen does have his flash up. His flash just allows him to easily win team fights, to easily just end up winning his team the game, because as long as his ultimate's up in a late game team fight, and as long as his flash is up, then he's pretty much guaranteed to get a nice team fight off. He's also a great laning champion. He's a ranged champion, so that means that he really doesn't have any hard counters in the laning phase. He's also got his E, which is the movement speed buff, so it makes it really hard to gank a Kennen in the early game. Moving on to when and when you shouldn't pick Kennen, I would not pick him if the enemy team does lock a Janna, just because Janna's disengage does counter Kennen's engage pretty hard. Also, I would look to pick him if the enemy team is pretty low mobility. So if they have a no gap closer mid laner and a no gap closer AD carry, then that is a great situation to pick Kennen. Also, if your team is lacking that AP damage, look to pick him in that situation. I would try to avoid Irelia and Jarvan. Those are two matchups that he does struggle with a little bit, and I would look to pick him against a Gnar, a Jax, or a Darius, just because he can poke those champions really easily, and if those champions do try to engage on him, for example, if Jax jumps on him with his Q, then Kennen can kite back with his E and just trade damage really nicely, so definitely look to pick him in those matchups. And to round out this video, at the number 1 spot is going to be Malphite. So Malphite is just overall a really low risk, high reward champion right now in the top lane, in my opinion. He can do well in most matchups. He's not going to stomp lane most of the time, obviously, but he can at least go even in the laning phase. And then once he does get a few armor items, he just becomes a monster, especially in this meta, because we're seeing a lot of AD top laners being played right now. Because of the buffs he did get to his W a few patches ago too, it means he's going to be even more tanky now, and he's going to deal more damage, because if you do not know, his W does, whenever you rank it up and whenever you get armor, his W will increase your armor, so it's just a really strong ability, and I would definitely look to max that first if you are in a harder matchup, or if you are going up against like an AD top lane champion. He's also really tanky, yet he still does so much damage. You can go like Iceborne Gauntlet for your one like kind of damage item, and then after that you can go full tank, and you can still pretty much like one-shot squishy targets, which is just absolutely insane. He's got a really good team fight too, obviously, with his ultimate. His ultimate is just such a great ability once it does get to a mid to late game team fight. When you're playing AD carry against a Malphite, it's kind of even harder to play against a Malphite as AD carry than it is to play against a Kennen, just because Malphite's ultimate is pretty much instantaneous, and it's such a long range ability as well, so it's a nightmare when you are playing AD carry against Malphite, especially if you are playing someone like a Twitch or a Jinx or a Kog'Maw. So when and when should you not pick Malphite? Look to pick him if the enemy team does have an AD top laner or if they do have a heavy AD comp, just because his W and his E both do scale off of armor. I would avoid him if the enemy team does have a Rumble, a Swain, or an Irelia though. Those three champions do tend to do pretty well against Malphite. They are AP champions besides Irelia, so Rumble and Swain can do a pretty good job in the laning phase at just poking him down and bullying him out, just because you're not going to get the most effect out of Malphite's W against those champions because they deal AP damage and Malphite's W does increase his armor. And lastly, to round out the video, the honorable mentions are going to be Cassio, Wukong, Irelia, Pantheon, Kayle, Rumble, and Riven. So I want to talk about Riven here because the championship Riven skin did just get released again, so we're probably going to be seeing a lot of Riven in this patch. Now, I do think she is a very strong champion in the right hands, so if you haven't played a whole lot of Riven, then I wouldn't recommend playing her just because this skin came out. Of course, you can do what you want, but I've seen so many Riven players just like feed in the early game, and Riven is a champion to where she's kind of feast or famine. If you don't do well in the early game as her, then you're not going to be very successful unless you do somehow end up getting kills in team fights. But if you are playing against a Riven this patch, which you probably will, then I'm going to recommend a few champions here that you can play against her to try to beat her in the laning phase. So the first champion I would recommend would be Kennen. Kennen does have the ranged advantage obviously in this matchup, and as long as you can poke her down and kite away with your E, then you can do really well in that matchup. Irelia can also do really well. It is more of a skill matchup, but once you do hit your Trinity Force spike, then you should be able to all in the Riven pretty easily. And then another champion that does well against Riven is Pantheon. Pantheon can easily poke down Riven in the early game, and he can also block her auto attacks obviously with his passive, so he can also do pretty well in that matchup. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. If you did enjoy, then please be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you guys have not already. So thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.